Tell us the difference between the film you set out to make, the film you ended up making, and why the difference came about.
Okay, so the film I set out to make was one that explored, in many ways, what really goes on Everest, you know. I mean, so many of these other movies have been made that show the heroic pursuit of foreign climbers and Westerners climbing Everest, but they don't really show, and what I had observed on other Everest expeditions that I had worked on as a camera operator, the extent to which the Sherpas are doing all of the work. And that hasn't always been the case on Everest, but it's certainly been the case for the last 10, 20 years. And so I really set out to shine a light where it isn't normally shone, I guess, and to highlight the disproportionate risks that Sherpas take in taking foreigners to the summit of Everest and back. And so what it might seem strange, I never really set out to make a climbing film. The climbing part of it was a vehicle to, you know, at the spine of the film through which to explore the nature of those risks and the nature of the inherent conflict between the Sherpa people who see the mountain as a spiritual entity and the foreigners that want to come and climb it. There's an inherent conflict there. Yeah. And so when the avalanche happened on the 18th of May, you know, at 6:30 in the morning, you know, the first instinct was to grab the camera. And what it ended up resulting in was, you know, a change in course of the film in that the story started to become an industrial dispute, a story about, you know, Sherpa people standing up and uniting in their grief and anger and deciding that they wanted to shut the season down, which had never happened before. So I think when you set out to make a documentary, you have to be prepared for the fact that you are making a documentary, unless you're making a historical one and everything is being told in retrospect. And I didn't want to make that kind of film. I wanted to make a film that had an unfolding drama. And so while the film changed completely in many ways, because it was no longer a film about climbing Everest, it was a film about an industrial dispute, the film I really set out to make in many ways actually never changed. You know, if I look at the film that we ended up with and the story that the story it was really about was the same film that I set out to make. And that might seem a bit strange because it was so dramatically shifted, but I think the issues that I was seeking to highlight were thrown under a microscope because of what happened.
So despite this huge shift, or this huge event and huge shift of focus, you ended up basically giving voice to the same issue that you set out to discuss in the film.
Look, exactly, and the avalanche really only served to highlight the point that we were sort of trying to make. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of people say, oh, you went to make this one film and you ended up with another film. It's not really the way I see it. And because, you know, the ins and outs of the details that happen in the middle of the film, you know, you make a film about something, but you're really making a film about something else. And the something else that I was making the film about, which was, you know, the inherent conflict in this idea of this mountain that means totally different things to two different groups of people, that never changed. And highlighting the disproportionate risks that the Sherpas make in doing this job, that never changed. In fact, that was just all highlighted more.
Now, you made a wonderful documentary called Solo a few years ago?
Yeah, back in 2008, actually.
Okay. So you've been making documentaries for how long now?
My documentary filmmaking career began with the race series on the ABC. Do you remember Race Around the World?
Yes!
I did the final series of that, Race Around Oz, which was the kind of poor cousin to the Race Around the World series. And then I went off and I worked at IF magazine for a long time, and I would sort of sneak out of that office and go off to the Himalayas and run around and do these jobs as a camera operator just because it was fun and because I was being offered these jobs.
Okay, so firstly, how long a stretch?
So since 2000 I've been making films.
Now, just as a preliminary question, what's a nice Sydney girl like you doing hanging around the Himalayas with a camera? Join the dots for us. How did you end up there?
I had a bunch of Kiwi housemates that, you know, were mountaineers, as most New Zealanders seem to be, and I went trekking with one of them into the Himalayas, and And he said, kid, you can climb. You know, your body really works well at altitude. And he introduced me to Russell Bryce, the expedition leader at the heart of this film. And I decided to go and make a film for Dateline about the Sherpas 10 years earlier. It was the 50th anniversary of the ascent, and I thought, where are the Sherpas in all of this? You know, where's their side of the story? I was always a little bit more interested in that side of it. The first time I went to the Himalayas, you know, it just felt to me that there was this inherent conflict in these two ideas. And so I did that, and that turned out pretty well, you know, in that I started to get offered all these other camera operating jobs in Everest. And when you're a young aspiring documentary filmmaker, you say yes to those opportunities because they're few and far between. And so by doing that, I just kind of ended up being in a position where I got better and better jobs. I ended up as the high altitude director for a big Discovery Channel series called Everest Beyond the Limit, where, you know, and other expeditions as well, where I observed all of these things, you know, right up to the summit where crazy stuff happens, and then, you know, foreigners come back down and they forget the name of the Sherpa that just saved their life, or they forget to mention them in their book, and all of these things. So it was that kind of accumulated years of experience that meant that I could make the film that I then found myself making in 2014.
Great, because I want you to address the issue of the split mindset of the documentary maker. Whereas on the one hand, you're making this movie and you're in the middle of this tragedy and you want to be compassionate and ethical and humane in how you cover it. At the same time, there must surely also be a dispassionate, mercenary part of your mind thinking, I'm up here in the middle of this huge event and I've got cameras. Thank you, documentary God. Can you just address both sides of that mindset, please?
Well,
provided you agree with it.
Oh, no, it's a really good question, because, you know, the documentary mongrel instinct is, you know, you chase a story and you know those things are documentary pixie dust, you know, to a certain extent. But what I can tell you is it didn't really feel like that at the time. It felt more like, holy shit, I probably don't have a film now. And it felt that way for quite a while. And in fact, I really only, I probably started to think maybe we have got a film here when at the very end, my very last interview back in the Sherpa villages, Purvatashi said, I quit climbing. I thought, okay, maybe I have a film here because I have an arc. But it was so, I didn't know half of what was being said in those protest meetings. I had my translators with me, but we were just on the run. And this happened so early in the season that we'd really only just started to get our sea legs. And so I really didn't know if I had a film. So I didn't know if this, I knew that this was historic. I knew that it was important, but I still didn't know that I had a film. And in fact, the investors in Universal got really cold feet. And my producers were protecting me from the worst of that, but they weren't sure. It became very clear that they wanted the summit. And even though I, in my mind, was never really making a climbing film and that the summit probably wasn't that important, it became very clear that it was important to them, which is kind of ironic in a way, in a film that was really supposed to be about the Sherpas. But when I got back, I had to, I mean, it took almost months really to get all of the footage transcoded. We had so many different formats. Then we had to get it all translated. Then you have to kind of then work those translations such that they make any sense to you, because you need to get them edited. And, you know, our immediate interpreter was, you know, his English isn't amazing. His Sherpa and Nepali is very good. And then all of your other interviews transcribed, and then you have to sit back and read it and then watch all 400 hours of footage and then try and understand how you're going to structure this film. So it's really only probably a month or two in that was like, okay, I think we might have something pretty good here.